Jim Miller's stack registered the shift in mass before his eyes did. Conscious awareness dragged itself up from the floor of a deep, chemical sleep, hitting the light like a physical impact. He wasn't alone. Across his chest lay a sprawl of lavender-toned bioorganic hardware, Nyxala. The morning sun cut through the grime on the window in jagged, clinical strips, highlighting the opalescent sheen of her skin. She looked less like a housekeeper and more like a high-end combat synthetic left in a graceful, predatory heap. What the actual frag? He rasped. His throat felt like it had been scraped with industrial sandpaper. He did a quick internal diagnostic, trying to map the last 6 hours. Nothing but static. Above him, her head, a smooth, hairless dome topped with a sensory crest that looked fragile enough to snap and sharp enough to kill, was tucked under his jaw. The friction of his own mammalian hair against her cool, serpentine curves was a sensory mismatch that spiked his adrenaline, pinning him to the sweat-dampened sheets. He shifted, a microscopic movement that triggered her proximity sensors. Nyxala's eyes, deep, sapphire-tinted apertures that looked like they could process data across a dozen spectrums, snapped open. For a heartbeat, the air in the room was a pressurized vacuum. Then she rolled off him with the silent, oily precision of a high-spec infiltrator, her crest twitching in a display of what he assumed was shame, though with Xylosari you never could tell. "By the stars, Mr. Miller. My apologies are a void," she said. Her voice was a low-frequency hum, melodic but with a serrated edge that suggested it could cut through a bulkhead if she leaned into it. "The fault is a systemic failure on my part. I failed to cross-reference my species' hard-coded biological imperatives with your local social protocols." Jim hauled himself up, the gray sheets feeling like lead. He wrapped the linen around his waist, trying to salvage some scrap of dignity while his heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "Nyxala," he said, his voice flat and dangerous. "I'm going to need a full data dump on why I just woke up as your personal heatsink." She perched on the edge of the bed, a lavender-hued enigma completely unbothered by her own nakedness. "The Xylosari are communal sleepers, Mr. Miller. It's a biological efficiency. We share thermal energy to maintain core processing levels. It's hardwired into our marrow. I saw your form, losing heat in the dark, and my lizard brain overrode the professional software." She paused, her crest darkening to the color of a fresh bruise. "I overlooked the human tendency to treat the sleeping quarters as a fortified zone. It's a bunker, Nyxala. Not a communal lounge," Jim muttered. He plowed a hand through his hair, his eyes scanning the room as if looking for an exit strategy. The morning light was a prying bitch, reflecting off the ridges of her alien anatomy and tracing the microscopic circuitry of her crest. "And yet," Nyxala continued, a flicker of predatory amusement sparking in those sapphire eyes, "the heat you output is high-grade. It's a biological furnace. Frankly, it's intoxicating." The bed frame groaned as she shifted her weight. The air in the room felt thick, ionized, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. Every breath felt heavy in Jim's lungs. "Nyxala, look. I appreciate the evolutionary history lesson, but on this rock, this kind of close-quarters contact is a loud and clear signal for a very different set of appetites." Her crest rippled like a flag in a high-velocity wind. "Appetites? Ah." Her pupils dilated until the blue was almost gone. "The mating dance? How unnecessarily complex. On Xylos, that involves a lot more kinetic energy and a higher probability of structural damage. This was just a recharge. And yet," she added, her lips curving into a razor-thin smile, "your own biosignals are composing a very different set of telemetry right now." Jim felt the heat spike in his face. "Grenix, Nyxala. You can't just, we need to establish hard-coded boundaries. Firewalls. Between my space and yours." "As you command," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that vibrated in his marrow. She stood and moved to her uniform, a stiff, utilitarian shell, retrieving it with a fluid grace that made his teeth ache. "Though I'll be archiving the thermal data from this morning for quite some time." As she geared up, Jim watched the play of muscle and light. He'd contracted her through Help at Home Galactic, looking for someone to keep the dust off his stacks, not a lavender-skinned complication that threatened to blow his internal fuses. Perhaps, Nyxala suggested, her voice muffled as she pulled on the fabric of her station, we could analyze these cultural glitches over breakfast. I've been running simulations on your kitchen hardware. I want your feedback on my attempt at these pancakes. A dry, jagged laugh escaped Jim's throat. Pancakes. The universal peace offering. Fine. But get this, clothing is non-negotiable in the common areas. Full coverage. No exceptions. Noted and logged, she replied, her eyes tracking him with a digital intensity. A curious directive, considering you're currently sitting there in the raw. The point is taken, Jim said, rubbing his eyes. Go play with the stove. I'll be out once I've re-engaged my own armor. She glided toward the door, a specter of high-functioning efficiency. At the threshold, she paused, her silhouette a sharp, lethal angle against the hallway. And Jim? Let's not let the morning's calibration errors color the rest of the day. The color's already set, Nyxala, he said with a grimace. But call me Jim. After waking up like that, the formal titles feel like a bad joke. Her crest shivered with a strange, bioluminescent pulse. Jim, she said, the name sounding like a whispered threat. Understood. But be warned, the Xylosari don't just work. We integrate. We're the ghost in the machine. You might find me difficult to uninstall. She slipped into the corridor. Jim fell back onto the bed, staring at the ceiling as the shadows danced in his peripheral vision. Frag me, he hissed. I've invited a virus into the mainframe. When he hit the kitchen 20 minutes later, the air was heavy with the smell of scorched batter and something metallic. Nyxala was a blur of lavender motion, her uniform a tactical fit that did nothing to hide the alien geometry of her hips as she worked the griddle. The data indicates a preference for blueberries, she said without turning. I salvaged some from the cryo unit you call a fridge. Jim sat on a stool, feeling like he was under interrogation in his own home. You've been mining my personal archives. The agency provided a comprehensive dossier on your habits, she said, sliding a plate toward him. The discs were golden brown, smelling better than they had any right to. Though it missed the chapter on your phobia of communal thermoregulation. That's because on Earth, we don't usually entwine our biology with the help, Jim said. He took a bite. It was a sensory overload of sugar and heat. Holy frag, these are incredible. Her crest flushed a deep, saturated violet. I aim for total optimization. I'm not just here to process your calories, Jim. I'm here to map the ghost that runs your hardware. He stopped chewing, his eyes narrowing. Explain. I find human courtship to be a mess of inefficient signaling, she said, leaning against the counter. Her sapphire eyes were locked on his. The subtext, the hesitation, the tension that hums like a live wire. Does my lack of encryption bother you? It's a bit of a shock to the system, Jim admitted, his pulse starting to hammer a heavy, rhythmic code against his ribs. Good, she purred. I prefer the direct approach. And your symmetry, it registers very high on my aesthetic processes. Jim nearly choked on his coffee. Nyxala, you're a high-spec marvel, but we have a professional contract. Hard lines. A contract is just a set of rules meant to be patched, she countered, her crest rippling with amusement. The Help Home Galactic Charter has a workaround, a clause for those who find their biosignals syncing up across the void. Of course they do. Capitalism always finds a way. Subsection C. It's quite elegant, for a legal patch. Jim let out a jagged sound that might have been a laugh. You're an impossible piece of work. And you're the mountain I'm going to climb, she said, her hands already moving with surgical precision as she cleaned the kitchen. Shall we move on to the restructuring of your living space? Work, Jim agreed, standing up. But first, we're going to have a serious talk about the concept of a closed door. I'll archive the data, she promised. But remember, Jim, the flow of information is a two-way street. The next few weeks were a descent into a high-tension intimacy. Living with Nyxala was like navigating a live minefield in the dark, dangerous, exhilarating, and completely unpredictable. He caught her one afternoon in the doorway of his office, arms full of his laundry like she was harvesting his skin. Nyxala, why are you haunting the threshold with my shirts? I've reorganized your clothing storage based on Xylosari tactical logic, she said, her voice a low-frequency vibration. But you seemed spiked when I brought up the material density of your undergarments at dinner. Because, by the Greenwich, you don't discuss a man's boxers while he's eating pasta. A fascinating biological taboo. You hide the foundation of your comfort behind a firewall of silence. It's called privacy, Jim groaned. Can we start with the knock-and-wait protocol? Why signal at the door when the connection is already live? She asked, her eyes glowing like twin sapphire LEDs. We share the air, the heat, the space. Why pretend we're isolated nodes? Because I'm a human, not a hive mind. Jim shouted, but he couldn't keep the grin off his face. Your heart rate just redlined, she noted, her crest perking up. Is it the talk of hive minds, or the fact that I'm currently holding the fabric that touches your skin? He broke into a rough laugh. You're a relentless piece of software. How do you even track my pulse? Xylosari empathy is just high-gain biosensors, she said, dropping the laundry. I feel the heat spikes. Since we shared that bed, I've been hard-synced to your frequency. Synced? We're bonded? A preliminary handshake, she said, her voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. I can feel that despite your defensive routines, you're craving the proximity. He backed away until his desk hit his spine like a physical barrier. Your pupils are wide open, she observed, her voice clinical but intense. You're a case study in suppressed appetites. Boundaries, Nyxala, he managed, though her scent, like ozone and rain, was filling his head. I'll give you your space, she said, retreating with a mock bow. But I've set up a ritual on the lawn. A picnic. A high-calorie interface for potential mates. Potential? Don't fight the download, Jim. The picnic is ready. In the garden, under the twisted, skeletal limbs of an old oak, she'd laid out a spread that looked like a tactical supply drop. I've integrated your local peppers into Xylosari gels, she said, her skin shimmering in the harsh sunlight. A fusion of heat and biochemistry. Jim sat down, feeling like he was walking into a beautifully designed trap. This is way outside your job description. This is field research, she said, her eyes locked on his. I'm testing the human capacity for total system surrender. Surrender is a heavy word. And yet your hands are shaking, she noted softly. The agency didn't give me a timeline for the harvest, so I'm working on my own data. It's not that simple, he tried to say, but the words felt like lead in his mouth. It's as simple as a hard reboot, she said, leaning in until he could see the complex iris patterns in her eyes. What does your lizard brain tell you when I'm this close? Her crest rippled with a deep, aching blue. Jim leaned forward, the distance between them evaporating like steam. I'm a predictable piece of hardware. No, she breathed, her lips a hair's breadth from his. You're a man who's finally found his son. 2 weeks later, the air in the house was thick with vesper dust. Nyxala was tracing glowing, bioluminescent code across Jim's bare chest. This is the confluence, she murmured. Our biosigns are becoming a single thread. I can feel your heart hammering like a trapped bird. The world outside was a grey smear. There was only the lavender of her skin and the gold glow of the dust. Now, she commanded, her voice a low-frequency hum in his bones. The sync. Lean back into me. As he hit the contact point, the vesper dust flared. It was a sensory overclock, a flood of her data, her longings, and the ancient, digital songs of her people. Nyxala, he groaned, his voice heavy with the weight of her soul. Humans, we have our own ways of merging the hardware. Show me, she whispered. What followed was a violent, beautiful collision of systems, human intensity meeting Xylosari precision. They moved in a cloud of glowing dust, their empathic sync turning every touch into a high-voltage discharge. I should tell you, she panted later, her head on his shoulder, that our biologies are more compatible than your labs ever predicted. We've started a new process. Jim propped himself up, eyes wide. A new process? Hybridized reproduction, she said, her crest pulsing with a soft, maternal light. Help Home Galactic has several thick manuals on the legal fallout of such a miracle. Jim started to laugh, a deep, resonant sound that felt like it was shaking the foundations of the house. I just wanted the place cleaned, Nyxala. And instead, you've inherited the future, she said. The clinic was all cold glass and holographic readouts. Jim stared at the data stream on the wall. A high-performance development, Overseer Vorkale said, his long fingers dancing across the interface. A son. He hits the ground in 6 Earth weeks. 6 weeks. Jim felt like he'd been hit by a freight train. Xylosari gestation is optimized for speed, Nyxala said, her hand on her stomach. But the mood shifted. A high-priority comm from the deep void flared to life. Nyxala's progenitors were incoming. Is the Earth-mate ready for the audit? The voice of Prime Arbiter Zareth boomed, cold and sharp as a scalpel. Audit? Jim asked, his blood turning to ice. The trials of worthiness, Matriarch Shera added, her image shimmering with gold. Survive the clash of echoing souls, boy, or your history. The arena was a massive, echoing cage of reinforced steel. Jim stood before Zareth, who loomed like a tower of purple obsidian. A plasmacide hummed in the Arbiter's grip. Defend your right to the line, Earthson. Zareth roared. Jim gripped his own blade, his knuckles white. From the high galleries, Shera watched with eyes like cold diamonds. You've got her rhythm, Zareth noted, parrying Jim's desperate strike. You've integrated her code. I've integrated the whole fragging galaxy since I met her, Jim grunted, his breath coming in jagged gasps. Indeed, Zareth laughed, his scythe tracing a lethal arc. The bed incident, a clumsy initial handshake, but look at the data now. Suddenly, a cry of pure, high-frequency agony ripped through the air. Nyxala had collapsed, her crest flaring with a light so bright it cast long, jagged shadows across the steel. The gate is opening. Now. But the timeline. Jim screamed, dropping his weapon. The combat stress. Overseer Vorkale shouted from the sidelines. Biological urgency has overridden the schedule. It's a beautiful catastrophe. Help her. Jim roared, skidding across the floor to her side. The blessings. Shera shrieked, descending from the heights. The protocol must be observed. Mother. Nyxala barked, her lavender skin slick with the sweat of labor. Forget the code. The child is exiting. There's a workaround, Vorkale whispered, his eyes gleaming. The convergence of primal genesis. A high-risk weaving of combat energy and birth. Do it, you fragging idiot. Zareth commanded. The family must form a circuit, the doctor said. The scythes must be turned inward to cushion the impact. Do it, Nyxala gasped, her fingers crushing Jim's hand. They stood in a circle of humming light, the Arbiter, the Matriarch, and the Earthson. Their scythes woven into a canopy of violet fire. Incredible! Vorkale's voice was a feverish staccato. The human's biofield is anchoring the Xylosari storm. The child is thriving in the interface. Push, Nyxala. Jim bellowed, his own body shaking with the sympathetic overclock of the bond. He could feel the child, a spark of pure potential, fighting to hit the light. The crests. Shera sobbed. They are deploying. The air in the chamber began to vibrate, a low, guttural roar. The energy peaked, a crescendo of lavender and gold. Now. Vorkale screamed. A blast of bioluminescent glory erupted, a silent explosion that whited out the world. When the data cleared, a new voice was screaming, a high-gain wail of both earth and sky. By the ancient stars, Zareth breathed, his scythe falling dark. His perfect. The baby was a masterwork of biological integration, ivory skin with violet shadows, human eyes that held the blue of the Xylosari deeps. He looked at the world with a weight that suggested he'd already archived its history. You stood in the fire, Earthson, Zareth said, placing a heavy hand on Jim's shoulder. You're part of the mainframe now. Can I take a break? Jim asked, his voice shaking as he held his son. The mission never ends, Shera said, smiling through tears. But the warrior can rest. He's the first of the new weave. The genetics. Vorkale was already scribbling. Total integration. A new species. A new chapter. Doctor, Jim said, his voice like cold steel. Shut it. This is a family moment, not a lab report. Of course, but the naming, the ritual. His name is Tommy, Nyxala said, her voice a fragile thread of gold. An Earth name. Solid. Relentless. Tommy, Jim whispered, and the child's tiny crest shivered in sync. A name for the markets, Zarif conceded. But he'll have a name for the void, too. And the proclamation, Shera added. Later, Nyxala commanded. The system is exhausted. We sleep. Jim looked at the lavender woman and the ivory child, and he felt a laughter rising in him that was bigger than the ship, bigger than the void. Something funny, Earth-son? Just thinking how this all started, Jim said, his eyes wet. With a bed and a bad translation. And now we're the future. The diplomatic implications. Volkale shouted. Not now, Doctor. They all roared, as the ship sailed on into the black.